Okay. Good evening, everyone. Do you hear me and see the slides? Yes, wonderful, great. Okay, good. It's great that everybody's here. It's great that everybody's in a very nice mood, despite these difficult times. Nina will come back, I'm sure, and thanks for preparing everything. Sorry for the technical hiccup at the start. I briefly start with introducing myself. My name is Oskar Stein. I'm assistant professor at Campus Friesland, University of Groningen. I'm part of the Department for Governance and Innovation, and I'm also a member of the Data Research Center at Campus Friesland. My background is law and philosophy, and I use and combine the two disciplines to think about regulatory frameworks and the meaning and impact of emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence or distributed ledger technology. And we are living, as all of you know, in times where life is a little bit different than what we are used to. So I hope that everybody is well and also feels well, and that all your family members are safe. And this is also a time where we are confronted with completely, for many of us, very new situation. So when we have a new situation, we try to understand it, and for that we, of course, need data. And I think one of the positive aspects that we have in this point in time is that we have much more data than we ever used to have before to understand what is going on. However, it is also clear, and I think after a couple of weeks, for everybody who is participating today, that despite the fact that we have so much data, the question is still, what do we actually know, even if we have all of this data available to us, and how can we use it to actually gain insights? And one of the questions that appears in this sort of process is, with which kind of values are we trying to approach the situation and shape the situation, which is so unusual for us, and how can we actually go forward in a productive way, but also in a way which actually leads us to a better and more positive outcome at the end of the day. And so this is why I think when we're in situations like this, that values such as privacy and fundamental rights in general are so crucial to help us in developing a strategy to find a way. But of course, lots of people will say some values in times like this are more important than others, and this brings me to the first thesis. So here you have a slide with different kinds of theses. This is something that we often hear, and many politicians say that privacy is a non-absolute human right. So how important in times like these, where we really have to understand what's going on and find a positive way forward, can something like privacy be? And now talking a little bit about this aspect of privacy as being a non-absolute right. So first of all, we can say the privacy is a universal right because it's enshrined on the level of the United Nations for the whole world in the two most important human rights treaties, or declarations that we have. So that's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948, but also legally more important from 1966, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And on top of that, we have privacy as a human right enshrined in many regional treaties. In Europe, we have several. We have the European Convention on Human Rights. We have the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU. And of course, we have our national constitutions. But every region in the world has some kind of treaty where privacy is enshrined. Again, it's a non-absolute human right, and apologies if you cannot read this well. This looked a little bit better on my original slides, so apologies for that. But what many people, and what usually is not part of the discussion when people say privacy is a non-absolute human right, is the question on the other side. So how many absolute rights are there actually? And then the first question is, what makes a human right absolute? Now, absolute means that it's under no conditions whatsoever, war, crisis, and so on, possible to infringe against this right or to limit the right in some kind of dimension. And then actually when we look at what we have, and this is usually surprising when I shared it with people, is that there are not that many absolute human rights that have their guarantees standing under all kinds of conditions and circumstances. So what we have in Europe, when we look at the European Convention on Human Rights, which is the most important treaty in this respect, is we have a prohibition of torture, we have a prohibition of slavery or servitude, we have the right to life, but not the right to life as such as an absolute human right, because many of you know that there is, for example, a discussion about euthanasia. So there, as a society, we find a way to limit the right to life. So it's not absolute as such, but there is no death penalty in Europe, under what circumstances ever, also in war and so on. And then there is no punishment without law. And what is also enshrined is the bis in idem principle. So that means that it's not possible to punish somebody twice for the same offense. Then when we look and take that further on an international level, that whole discussion becomes much more complex, because there are less guarantees than we are used to having in Europe. Europe now being the Europe of the 47 member states of the Council of Europe, which is not only the member states of the European Union, but includes and will continue to include the United Kingdom and other countries such as Turkey, Russia, Azerbaijan, Switzerland, and so on. So it's 47 states, around 850 million people, which are sort of protected by this European Convention of Human Rights. But of course, when we look then at the world, there are much less guarantees. So we still have the prohibition of torture, we still have the prohibition of slavery or servitude, and then we have another sort of gray area, which is called in technical terms the jus cogens. So it's like the obvious law, which includes things like the prohibition of maritime slavery, genocide, and all these kinds of things. But there already is a discussion, since this is not law which is enshrined in treaties, what actually does it entail and what actually does it not entail. So the point of this whole first bit being that, yes, privacy is a non-absolute human right, but I would argue, and we can discuss this later, that all of those rights that we are actually thinking of when we think of a modern democratic European society that really make it worth living, that really set it apart, are in fact non-absolute human rights. And that is not only privacy, and that brings me to the next slide, which fortunately you can read much better. So this is the quote from Edward Snowden, he worked for an ex-contractor of the National Security Agency in the United States, and then became a privacy advocate by starting with his revelations that the United States government and many other governments around the world are actually surveilling people much more intrusively than they ever said they would in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks in 2001 on New York, on the World Trade Center. And what is interesting is it's now almost 7 years, right? So in June, it will be 7 years that Edward Snowden already started with his revelations. And here he says that, and he really, I think, highlights that very well, that when we think about privacy, then we usually often have this tendency to think about, yeah, somebody has something to hide, or it's really about a personal space or something like that. But in fact, he points out, and I think this is very important, that when we talk about privacy, we have to talk about the relationship of the individual and the space of the individual and what is the space of society. So it's much more complex than that. Privacy and having your own personal space to create your opinion is part of that. But this is also a connection to freedom of expression or to the right to information, to find those or also then to find that information actually that you really are interested in. So it's really about the space that the individual gets in order to participate in society, and it's much more about individual autonomy than rather just your own personal protected space, which I think is very important. And so now combining the first two theses, what you see here is Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights, and all of these non-absolute rights in the European Convention on Human Rights actually work the same. So what you have is two paragraphs. The first paragraph enshrines the right. You see, this is a very nice and short sentence, but very abstract at the same point. So imagine you are a judge and you have to interpret that, what it actually means in detail, especially in the digital age when all of our things become more and more when it's very difficult to say what you leave on a mobile device is actually private or not. And then in the second paragraph, what you see is how that can be limited. And there need to be on the right side, I try to summarize that. So if you want to limit a human right, a non-absolute human right, what you need to have is it needs to be based on law. So that means non-arbitrary, realizing an objective that is necessary in a democratic society. So that is also something which is a precondition that we can talk about. And then when you look at what are those objectives that are necessary in a democratic society, you just need to look a little bit in the text of the second paragraph. So that is national security, public safety, or the economic well-being of the country, prevention of disorder or crime, protection of health, and the protection of rights and freedoms of others. But you can clearly see now when we think about the situation that we are in the pandemic situation, that it can be argued for some measures that the right to privacy is limited. And then still, if you want to do that, if you want to follow that objective, the third step follows, which means it has to be proportionate. Every measure has to be proportionate. So you have to choose a measure which is effective, the least invasive measure, and it needs to be worth it. And then when we try to make this a little bit more concrete and less abstract, when we think, for example, about the use of contact tracing apps, these are the sort of requirements that the use of contact tracing apps need to fulfill. So we have to ask ourselves, is there a legal basis? Is this realizing an objective that is necessary in a democratic society, which we both could probably argue yes. But then when it comes to the proportionality test, I think that is where we really get to the tough question. So is this an effective measure? Is this the least invasive measure that we can have? And is it at the end of the day, thinking about all of the other risks is it really worth to do this? And this brings me to the third thesis. We can discuss this then later in the after the presentation, which will still go on for about 10 minutes. And also I also please fill out a survey that we can then look together at the end. I personally would like to make the argument that it's responsible to insist on privacy. Why? Because we are already seeing, and this is a piece from the Economist, that there is something being built like the Coronopticon. So this is a pun on the Panopticon, which is an idea of Jeremy Bentham, the British philosopher from the 18th century, which is essentially an architecture where you can see what is going on all the time with all the inhabitants, and the modern problem and the problem of digitalization that we have with the with this idea of the panopticon and now with the coronopticon through the corona crisis, is that it's not a building that is standing somewhere and all of the people just who go inside are being monitored. No, our whole infrastructure is digitalized and being transformed in a way where the coronopticon or the panopticon is potentially everywhere. And so the tough question for us as a society is really to ask ourselves, do we need to change the way we manage these kind of situations where there is much more data available by default about all of us because we have our phones with us all the time, or because we now have to use the internet all the time, or because all of these technologies are essentially done in a way where, or in a way where we are being monitored all the time. And so this is the first argument I want to make, is that we have to really think about the long-term consequences here. The second argument I want to make is the way we are used to living in a modern democracy is not in a way where we have to think of solutions where we either have to choose between freedom and safety. Because often what you see when people start to discuss about these kind of issues is that they have this idea that there is somebody, you know, a legal judge holds a balancing scale like Justitia does here, and then either it's more on the side of safety or it's more on the side of freedom and privacy, but you always have the situation where you get a little bit less and a little bit more. And I think especially as citizens, we shouldn't be happy with solutions that have us choosing between the two. We should always look in the design of solutions, and that is what is not happening enough at this moment, for solutions which allow us to have both at the same time. So this is essential. And I think this thinking is very, very dangerous, because when you combine the argument that privacy is a non-absolute right, and then combine it with this sort of argumentation where you have to choose between the one and the other. So that is historically not, since the Second World War, not how our societies are working, but somehow about digitalization, about this phenomenon with the increasing control over society, has this sort of tendency that we get more and more these sort of discussions. So you have to choose the one or the other. You cannot have both. And I mean, so this is the 20th century solution to all of this would be sort of Freddie Mercury quote saying, "I want it all." So this is like the 20th century solution, which, you know, we would like to associate maybe with 1968 and all the movements that came afterwards. But actually, this is if we dig a little bit deeper in society, and I'm sure as many of you know, this is something which is going on for a very, very long time. Here you see the original German text from Immanuel Kant in the 18th century, Enlightenment, German philosopher, which has this famous phrase, sapere aude, dare to think, dare to be an individual for yourself. I think also in this situation where we live in, we have to also look at those historical lessons and try to apply them in what they are saying now. And this brings me to the next point, which is, so we need to use technology responsibly. And I would like to break it down in two. So the first one is, there is something that I think is a personal, individual sort of responsibility, and that is the one about digital hygiene. So we wrote something about it at the Data Research Center, and you can find it on the Data Research Center site, but essentially it's we have a tendency in these kind of situations to always go for the most convenient solutions, and you can very quickly see how this goes wrong with, for example, choosing very, very convenient video chat apps like Zoom, which then turn out not to be safe or not to be privacy preserving. Or to always go like with the messaging apps where we know our data is being mined, although there are many, many more alternatives out there. And there are really risks associated to that, because also during this pandemic, the number of cyber attacks has really increased. And, you know, as all business has to go more towards the online sphere, that's also true for criminals who like to go after their business. So I think we have an individual responsibility to really look there and check that that the way we use technology is responsible and safe, and not just go for the most convenient solution that is out there. But the second one, and that's more of a responsibility I think that we have together, is that we really have to remind ourselves that literally technology is not a panacea. So it's not the cure for everything. And I mean, I followed this whole discussion about contact tracing apps in particular over the last couple of months, as I'm sure many of you have been doing too. And I think it's just a perfect example that it tells much more about the society that we have become than what it actually tries to achieve. So we think if there is a problem, somebody comes up with a magic solution which somehow has got something to do with data, and we're not really asking ourselves, so what's really the problem that we're trying to solve with this? What is really needed to solve it, and how do we solve it in a proportionate manner? And what you see here on the bottom right side is that so what we have in many countries is when so first there is the question, is the use of such an app for contact tracing, is that voluntary or mandatory? And there are hardly any democracies except India, which is the largest democracy on earth, that has made the use of contact tracing apps mandatory. And what we see there is also very concerningly that there is a combination of not only contact tracing in terms of Bluetooth, but also location data being very, very much used. And everybody who works in a public or in a private office has to use this contact tracing app. So this is a perfect scenario for the creation of a surveillance state and of a totalitarian regime if this is being pushed to the limit and if this falls into the wrong hands. And then in the other countries where contact tracing apps are not mandatory, we have the problem that not a lot of people are using them. So Singapore is always, for example, claimed to be one of the very, very positive cases. And there we have an adoption rate of around 20%. Whereas epidemiologists tell us if these apps were to be really useful, then we would have to have at least 40% of people use that. Now, last week I read a news letter from the civil society organization Bits of Freedom that said that if you were to reach in the Netherlands 60%, which would be ideal, of penetration, that would mean that 10.3 million people approximately would have to install such an app. And that includes children and elderly. So practically everybody you know from the working population would have to have this installed on default by a phone. And then there is still the question, and this brings me to this news story here on the bottom right side of Iceland, which has been very, very early in adopting this kind of app, and where about 40% of people have used it. This still leaves the question whether the use of such an app is still effective. And in this article, somebody who's been working on contact tracing and doing the contact tracing, helping in the contact tracing efforts in Iceland, has been telling that actually it's not helped very much. And also in Australia, for example, which is one of the countries now which is really making a big push towards this direction. There was an article on Australia last week in The Guardian saying that only one person has been additionally identified through the use of the app. So we can discuss about this. All I'm saying is that it doesn't look at this point in time as if it's going to help very much, although it is potentially very, very, very invasive as a technology. But so again, I think this tells us a lot about the kind of society that we've become. So I didn't want to talk too long tonight. I just thought this was more like of an inspiration for discussion and questions that hopefully come up. And again, I really thank for the opportunity to speak today, and I'm looking forward to the questions and the discussion. And for those who haven't done so, here the reminder also from my side, we have a poll that is still going on, and you can still answer questions, and then we look at the answers together. So thank you very much.
So I'm going to give it a try again. Do you hear me now?
Yes, very well.
Finally. Sorry, people. Thank you very much, Oscar. And like you said, let's take 5 minutes or so to fill out the poll. And in the meanwhile, I'll just give a short summary of what I was saying while you weren't able to hear me. Well, my name is Nina Dieters. I'm a program maker at Generale. Yeah, like everybody else in the world, we are not able to do what we normally do, which is hosting live events and bringing people together. But in the meanwhile, we'll try to make the best out of it by hosting these online events. And I asked Oscar to answer my questions about the app that our government was planning to make, or yeah, they're actually making it now. So I'm curious if anyone has a question, and if so, you can unmute your microphone, or maybe first pose it in the chat. I haven't seen any questions in the chat. I just let us know if you have a question, and then I'll ask you to unmute your microphone, and it would be great if you
questions, comments, everything's welcome.
Yeah. How's the poll doing? Are people filling it in? You can see it on your screen, right?
Yeah. 15 only, but 10 are on the way.
I was wondering because, well, me as just a lay person, the question that rose for me was, why should I worry about privacy when it comes to tackling such a big problem as a pandemic? But basically, now we have the outline of why an app would be great or not. But how should people inform themselves about this kind of topic? Where should they find the proper information about what is the right way to go? Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think, for example, when it comes to, so one of the problems that many people had is which kind of video chat app to use, right? And we also had within our campus Friesland, we also had a lot of discussions about that. And so I think, first of all, it's really the sort of mindset. Usually there is always like this one champion or this one like convenient solution out there, and then often people go for that. And in general, that's okay, but what I miss often is that people are a little bit more skeptical and start to ask, okay, so this is working, but why does it work? How do they actually make money? And for example, this was one of the big problems with then using Zoom, that their whole business model is really very much focused on collecting personal data to a rather invasive degree. And what then I was very happy actually in the Netherlands was that the Data Protection Authority very quickly provided an assessment on which kind of apps, what works and what doesn't, and why doesn't it and why does not. So there's actually quite a lot of information available from that side, and I think that's very positive. But there, of course, there is also like a lot of information available in terms of like civil society organizations. So in the Netherlands, of course, there's Bits of Freedom, but there's also like a lot of international or American civil society organizations, such as the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Some people may know those because they also have like a lot of privacy preserving add-ons, or Privacy International, of course. And it's not too hard. I think it's actually very easy to find this kind of information, but it requires always like this moment of holding back and not just jumping for the obvious solution that works. Because then I think it's also for us as society in general a bit of a problem that we always have this tendency when it comes to the internet or to digital things to create this one champion, right? So everybody uses Google for search, everybody uses WhatsApp for messaging, everybody uses Instagram for, I don't know, checking out pictures. And I don't have in principle something against that. But the problem is that we all only use one platform. And I don't know why it's so difficult to, I mean, of course it starts with awareness, right? But to always like have this sort of mentality where one thing can be right. And yeah, so that would be my answer. So look for a combination between government sources and what civil society organizations say. But I think we have a question.
Yeah, Jacco, could you unmute your microphone and so we can hear you? That would be great.
Yeah.
Hello?
Yep.
Hello, we can hear you.
Yeah, hello. I have a question. My name is Koos, and it's a practical question. Tomorrow I have to go to the dentist, but to my great surprise, I have to fill a form this morning, or of I had COVID, yes or no, and I think it's totally useless to fill in such a form because tomorrow I can have the COVID and today not. So I feel, ja, ich fühle mich ein wenig angetast in meine Grundrechte. I say it in German, sorry.
It's fine, it's fine. It's no problem for me.
Yeah, how I have to deal with it.
Yeah, I can imagine that the background is actually more for the dentist, to be sure that they are legally sure that the people who come in at least claim that they don't have it, so that they have proof that people said they don't have it. But yeah, I would bring it up in a discussion and ask why it's really necessary.
Yeah,
and it's not as
I asked myself because the last sentence on the form was, yeah, when you arrive at the dentist, they can ask you again. That's that kind of question.
Yeah, but I mean, but my experience with these kind of things is that it's often difficult to solve it on the spot, but it helps a lot to discuss them, because it's much worse to just worry about it and not mention it, and then maybe they will also say it's not necessary. But I think that the actual reason is a legal reason, which is behind it, that they have to prove that all of the patients who are coming stated that they don't have it in case something would happen.
I have asked what the legal basis was, but they could tell me.
Well, that's very bad.
Yeah, even their professional organization.
Yeah, no, usually the legal basis is in the civil law.
Yeah, I think
actually,
so. But
yeah, it's a contractual thing, and it's more about the liability of the dentist, that they provide a safe environment also for everybody else. So for the other patients who are coming, that they can prove to them if something would be going on, or somebody would then have COVID, that they at least can claim, but all patients said that they don't have it. So I think that is probably one of the real, but it's good to bring these kind of things up, and also to mention that it's.
But my problem with it, and I said it to her, is the balance. Because she says to me, and I said, and how are you? Oh yeah, that's on our that you can see on our website. Hello.
Yeah.
Okay, next question.
I missed balance.
I think somebody else took the spotlight from Jacco. So I want to get back to the question that was asked in the chat. Jacco didn't turn on his mic, so I'll take the stage for him. One of the weird things in the discussion in general is that we talk about an app that's talking from a user perspective. Would it be more interesting to talk from the perspective of the information system that's a national government or scientific institute is building, and app feeds into the system? Could users choose for paper-based data storage at the personal level, and possibly for one of many apps that deliver similar information when that is needed? Could you comment on that?
Yeah, so I think it's a very good comment, because it's important to look behind the scenes and what's going on. And I think the discussion that's most problematic for me and for most people who deal with this from a privacy perspective. So it's right, there are many apps, but the thing that we are really concerned about is the contact tracing, because this requires an install basis which produces a permanent record of people's whereabouts. And then we can use which kind of technologies we use, whether it's just Bluetooth and proximity tracing, or whether it's really using also, like the Indians do, for example, GPS on top, so that you really have a comprehensive record where people are all of the time, right? So this is what I meant in the talk when I talked about an app. I'm not saying that using digital means in general is a bad thing. So I think it can be very, very good for information sharing. A lot of people have really don't know what the rules are. So there, I think it would often be very handy to have an app which is up to date and which is able to communicate in a very simple manner. Can I meet with my friends? Can I go out and have dinner or something like that? So in that sense, I think for communication purposes, it can be much better. I also think that, for example, being able to control or to contact somebody like the GGD here in the Netherlands, or a doctor or something like that, where I actually don't have to physically go there and don't have to put anybody at risk if I really think I have symptoms. That would be very good. And I think we're learning that through our lives that they are changing, and there are also good elements. I'm not saying this is generally bad, but the problem is that everything is so rushed. And I think, especially in the Netherlands, we saw that so greatly with their with this one weekend where the government tried to create this sort of app with the hackathon, and then had to push back. And now it's a bit all moved in a sort of like very, very modest way. I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, some countries like Germany or Switzerland, they are, or France. I read today also in France that there's going to be a contact tracing app. And I think what's actually good about this whole contact tracing discussion is that it's so obvious that everybody sees this is much, much more complicated than just creating an app, right? So I personally hope if there is something good coming out of this, then it's really that people understand data, creating these kind of mechanisms is much, much more complex and requires much more thinking. And that also requires us to create and demand a certain culture, which includes, for me, very firmly at the center, human rights. So they're not a burden. They are more of like a guideline based on historical experiences, which help us do the right thing. It was a very long answer.
No, but it's very. Vinny had a question. Sorry to hear you got kicked out. Could you maybe ask it yourself and unmute your microphone so we can hear you?
No? Okay. So Vinny, what's the
can you hear me now?
Yeah, great.
Oh, sorry, I didn't find the button. Thanks for everything. It's really, really interesting. I've got kicked out of the session, so this question might have been asked already. But I have to Zoom every day. Like, it's the most used app in my life for work and social reasons. And I'm trying to convince people to use different apps like Jitsi or whatever. But it's just impossible. So there's no way around for me to not use Zoom. But are there any ways how I can still protect my privacy while using this app, or by using it, I'm just committing to having my privacy rights being used by this gods of Zoom.
Yeah. Yeah, I get it. I hope I'm back again, because I was briefly disappearing, but I got from the question, please correct me if I'm wrong. So first of all, thanks that you're here. And second, that so that it's about using Zoom and the network effects around it, and that it's impossible not to use it because of many different reasons. And I also have to admit that I had to use it like 3 or 4 times now, even with a meeting with the European Commission. But please don't tell it to the data protection officer of the university, because we're formally not allowed to. And I'm one of the persons who always next him to tell people not to use things like this. So this gives you a very short answer to your question. Sometimes it's just not possible. But my experience, and that is also what I did, is that it helps to nag. It helps to go to to raise the issue. My main issue with Zoom is, in the meanwhile, I mean, it's also like criticism often helps. So I think if they wouldn't have gotten so much criticism regarding their privacy and security measures, they never would have done what they do now, which is really upgrading their kind of security environment. But my basic problem with the corporation is that the whole business model that stands behind it, which is really based on this monetization of personal data at the core. Now, if you really have to use it, yes, there is no way around it. It's always good to try to explore alternatives, but it's important also that we keep nagging. And sometimes institutions respond. So, for example, for everybody working at the university, I would like to advise or to advertise for a service that Surfdrive, the organization in the Netherlands that is providing a lot of infrastructures for people working in public institutions like universities, can use, so that they don't only have a cloud service, which is very privacy preserving, but also they used now, they created the video portal, which is based on Jitsi. And so what I'm trying to say is that in your personal capacity, there's only so much you can do, and it's also important not to overemphasize what can be done. So use the right or use something which is possible to use when there's an opportunity for that. If it's not, then please keep complaining, because eventually something might change.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks.
I think we'll do two more. Maybe after these two questions, we can go to the poll. Is
Yeah.
that so? Jennifer, could you unmute and ask your question?
Thank you, Oscar. Thank you so much for this presentation. I noticed I'm a bit anxious about how governments can eventually use the big data that we're probably going to provide them with. So one of my concerns is, do you really think that the pace in which we are designing these apps and such even makes safe development possible, like privacy by design?
So no, short answer is no. That is also one of the reasons why I was very interested in doing talks like this, and I try to do more like this, and you know, write with newspapers and publish articles, open access, and so on, because I think essentially the biggest problem is that everything happens so rushed. And I mean, it's good that there's a certain urgency to it, because, as I said, people really start thinking about it. But at the same time, if it really translates into sort of measures, it's very, once they are in place, it's so difficult to put them back. And I mean, we have a recent historical experience with everything that happened after 9/11, and the whole story about telecommunications retention, which is still in the high courts, and it's not solved. And really the big worst case scenario that appeared once everybody was talking about contact tracing and these apps was that this will be just another surveillance assemblage that is being created right now, and it has potential, maybe not in some countries, but for example, India is unfortunately on a really a difficult path now. And how much will it take to turn all of this back once people have got used to, have got used to that you can, when you go into a bank, that you check the phone and so on. It's not only the government context, it's really also the whole societal context around it. That's worrisome. So I think speed is a very, very big problem. But we have more questions.
Yeah, I think the last one would be from Faki. Sorry if I mispronounced your name. Could you unmute and ask your question, please?
Yeah, I think this follows up on what I just said, right? How to regulate the sunset procedures and winding down. So I think the first, so what's necessary is to have a law. In the Netherlands, for example, maybe I'm not aware enough of that, but I haven't never had seen any discussion about really a proper legal framework for it. I think it's not even really decided yet who is going to be the processor or the operator, and which kind of capacity. So everything's still a little bit vague, and with that also comes, of course, oversight. We have laws which do have, for example, provisions where 2 years after a law came into force, there's going to be a review, and then there can be some parliament discourse about it, and maybe we stop using this altogether. So from a procedural point, it's definitely possible to do this, but it needs to be in place, and it all starts with regulation and non-rush decisions.
Okay, maybe it's good time to check the results of your survey and reflect on that.
Yeah, so I will try to share my screen, and probably everything. Yes, it works. So there we go. Okay, so can you see me? Can you see it?
Yes, we can
All
see.
right. So here are the results. Feel a little bit like the Eurovision. Eurovision of Groningen or something like that. So in your opinion, is it necessary? You can still answer if you want, by the way. Is it necessary to use location data to control the pandemic? 6% say it's necessary. 25% say it's nice to have. 44% say it's more. So I think we have a majority which is leaning towards not using the app, or not as a high priority at least. So 6% say it's obligatory. 94% say if there would be a contact tracing app, it should be voluntary. Again, when it's obligatory, we have this dilemma that it's very invasive. When it's voluntary, the problem is not enough people use it. So there is actually Iceland so far is the country, and the population of Iceland, it's a couple of 100,000 people. So that's like I don't know, the province of Groningen or so. And therefore,
I always say.
Excuse me.
They compare Iceland to the city of Utrecht mainly.
Okay, but there the highest success rate is 40%, and usually epidemiologists always talked about 67% for this to be effective. So it's really, I even think from the kind of, there are some solutions out there for contact tracing where which seem to be very, very privacy preserving, but then the question is how accurate are they, because they collect much less data. So yeah, I think this is really a very, very difficult topic. Maybe apps for other users, as I mentioned during discussion, might be useful. Next question. Would you personally install an app? 78% say yes. I think this question depends really a lot on whether you get asked in an abstract way, like I do it now, because 78% say no, and only 22% say yes. So I really think, because I can imagine that even the 22% which say yes, now when they really have to do it in practice, they probably won't do it. But yeah, we agree to be skeptical about this. So which kind of safeguards would you like to see if the government used an app for COVID-19 tracing? So this is the answers that you gave. I just let them pass by one. Yeah, given period of time, I think we discussed that. Open interface, multiple apps, open source. Yeah, of course, open source would be nice. So a lot of governments also had difficulties with that. And not to cover the data received with the app, that's also an interesting one. So do you trust the government more, or do you trust private parties more? I think it's easier to regulate the government at least, or to have some sort of democratic control than, for example, Facebook, Google, or Apple. Extensive testing on privacy guarantees. Yes, of course, but as we all know also from the vaccine trials, extensive testing takes long. anonymizing the user data would be a priority. Also, I think this is very important, but the problem is that it's very difficult to anonymize user data these days, since there is more and more data about us available on the one hand. On the other hand, collection and analysis methods get much better, so you also need less to combine less data sources to actually find out which kind of people are behind it, even if you don't have the date of birth, etc. Data is secure and can only be seen by people who really need to see it. Yeah, also access is a big subject, and of course that the data gets deleted once it is no longer needed. So very good answers. Then if you think location data is useful, provide some keywords why you think so. Can be paper-based. Yes, of course. It can be. Maybe there is a thought behind it which I don't get. So I leave it there. Not useful. Spread monitoring, helpful for vulnerable people. Then the next one is if you think it is not useful. Accuracy. Yeah, accuracy is a big topic. So also when we really think only about using Bluetooth, then it's really about tracing of context. But what does, for example, happen if there is a window in between of you, or anything that prevents and protects that, for example, no aerosols can be exchanged? Or what do you do if you just have very, very small neighbors and very, very small walls? And I think we all have the everyday experience that we receive Bluetooth signals from neighbors who just live nearby, next to us, under us, below us, or so. If people follow the regulations, then the outbreak can be contained. I think this is a very good comment, because it highlights that at the end of the day, and that is also something that I find really concerning, we need to be able to trust that most of the people behave responsibly, and if you really motivate them to do that, that they actually also follow measures. And I think that this is definitely the element which still, despite all the digital tools and the data and so on that we have, that is most important, and that should really be key and center in all of this difficult situation. Okay, so what do we have left? Which measures do you think are the most important to control the pandemic? Staying home, physical distancing, so no holiday vacation. In summer, I see here. Washing hands, yes. Using apps to communicate with patients. I also think this is an interesting one. Wearing masks, not very popular in the Netherlands, and the apps for contact tracing in 5th place. Is there something else you would like to share? Seems that like everything has been said for the first participant. Bluetooth could be the alternative, but the technology is not created for these purposes, and it's really anonymous. Yes, there is. I think the jury is still out there how useful that would be. Who do we trust? Do we trust the local authorities? I also think that, for example, a lot of large corporations, especially Apple and Google, now really try to use this to make a gain that for their image and for their boost, because they created sort of a platform for contact tracing apps, and generally this platform is being regarded as relatively privacy preserving, which means that they are performing much better and therefore probably gaining more trust in this initiative than many governments, which want to be much more invasive. How is it possible that in a democratic society something like OMT rules without democratic check? Sorry, I don't get that. Data information can be very handy. Yeah. Okay. So I think that was it. I'll stop sharing my screen. Again, thanks for taking the time. And
thank you for your time and explaining just a bit more about well, at least making us think about should we have to want this app, yes or no, and what are the options, and how voluntary is voluntary, and that type of things. It really helps just to keep your mind going on things you see in the news dropped at you. Okay, I think we should end it there. I want to thank you all for joining in. We hope to see you in September again, hopefully live, but well, we never know. And check our websites in the meanwhile. Check our website in the meanwhile to see if any events are coming up. Yeah, that's it for now. Thank you very much, and have a good evening.